My name is Will. I'm head of climate action at the institution, as Shalini said. And I'm really grateful to be able to sort of share this story with you today, because it's not very often that we reflect on the work we've done and how we've got to where we are in our sort of professional world. We're often busy chasing the next projects and the next project, so it's quite good to sort of sit back and reflect. And it's been quite a roller coaster over the last few years in this space. I'm going to share with you both my sort of personal and professional journey that I've been on in the last 5 years or so, and with that tell you the story of how the institution has worked to embed sustainability at the heart of what it does. And I'm sharing this with you in the hope that you and others can learn from what we've done along the way, in the hope that we can sort of work together to inspire further action going forwards. So I watched a TED talk once, and they said that you've got to start by jumping back or forwards in time and give somebody an anecdote before you launch into the details. So this is a photo of me. See if you can spot me. I'm sat somewhere in the middle of this photo. I'm wearing elephant trousers, believe it or not. I've got a deck of cards in my hand and a rather big bushy beard. This photo is taken kind of in the middle of nowhere in the north of the Philippines, in a little town called Agani. It's about a half an hour drive by bus from the nearest city of Tuguegarao, which is about a day's travel from Manila. It's about 40 degrees Celsius when this photo has been taken, despite it being 8 p.m. And we're all kind of hot and sweaty after a day's work. And I'm surrounded by volunteers that I've been working with for the last few weeks on the building of a school just around the corner from where this photo was taken. And we've all been gathered together and we're all listening to the lady who stood up in the center of the shot, who at this point in time was basically telling us that we had about 48 hours to leave the Philippines. And the reason why was because this photo was taken in March 2020. And I'm sure you all remember what happened then. And basically, the country had been given notice that in 48 hours' time, Manila was going to shut to the world in order to try and stop the spread of COVID through its shores. And we were about a day and a half's travel from Manila airport at this point in time. So you can imagine what we sort of did next. We kind of hot-footed it to Tuguegarao and then got ourselves down to Manila and ended up at an airport that looks a bit like this at this point in time, and managed to get on one of the last flights out of the country. And at this point, you're probably wondering what on earth this has got to do with sustainability. And I'll sort of come back to this in a minute. But effectively, I'm telling you this because for many of us, COVID was a bit of a line in the sand. Lots of different reasons for different people. And for me, this marks a point in my journey where I started to move away from mainstream structural engineering and into the world of sustainability and advocacy. And to help you understand the context around that, we just need to go back a few more steps. So I worked for Arup for what I consider to be the sort of practicing portion of my career so far. I joined Arup fresh out of university. I got to work on amazing projects all over the world. I remember, it's slightly cringeworthy thinking back to it, but I remember in my interview explaining that I wanted to work on sexy buildings, sexy shiny towers. And I was into travel and design and fat pens and hanging out with architects. And I loved high-tech architecture, structure as a feature. And so for me, landing a job at Arup was pretty cool. 3 to 4 years into my work, you'll be glad to know I'd started to mature a little bit in my thinking about what was important. And I'd started to chase this idea of there being substance in our work and, useful buildings. And a few years later still, I was starting to talk in my appraisals and my conversations with my mentors about wanting to focus on what I considered at the time to be my 3 Ps, which were people, place, and profession. These are the Ps that describe the work that I wanted to do and that, in my opinion, was the sort of work that Arup should be doing. And I was drawn to certain types of projects. I remember in a pub one evening telling my boss that I point blank refused to work on the luxury apartment scheme that we'd recently won in the project because I wanted our work to be part of making a better world. And then one day I got this amazing opportunity to go and work on the design of a brand new university in Rwanda. This was 2018, so this was more or less 5 years ago, 5 years and a few months ago, that I got asked if I wanted to do this. And the project was called, or is still called, the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture. This is a 57-building, brand new university campus in the south of the country. Had about 20,000 square meters or 200,000 square foot of teaching space and accommodation. set over a campus that's something like 3,500 acres. So it was huge, biggest project I would ever work on in terms of sort of plan area. And I was attracted to this because of the scale, because of the fact it was in the middle of Africa, which is somewhere I'd never been, because of the unknown of working with the sorts of materials that the architects were proposing, working in that sort of climate and environment. And it's excited me, the idea of working with a sort of local engineering and architecture team on something of this kind of scale, and being able to learn from them about how they went about doing construction in an entirely different environment to where I'd been working for the last 8 or so years. And the purpose behind this project was all about sustainability. This is a conservation agriculture school. This is about upskilling the next generation of Rwandans so they can use the land in their country better to feed more people more sustainably for longer. And that purpose itself was great. But actually, the architects, Master Design Group, wanted to go even further still. They wanted the building and the project and the construction process all to be just as sustainable and useful as the end project, or the end product, rather. So the design was based on earth walls, locally sourced timber roofs, stone foundations, none of which is great for an earthquake zone. And they do have small earthquakes in Rwanda from time to time. And that all sounded really difficult. And that, to me, sounded really exciting. And this was not mud hut architecture. This was nothing simple. This was like some really bold architectural moves being made. And to my mind, high-tech architecture as well, structural expression. Look at those shrinkage joints in that middle photo and tell me you're not impressed if you're a structural engineer. The palette of materials that the architects were driving for was being driven by impact. We used some concrete and steel where nothing else would work, but that was mostly seismic tying and ground slabs. Everything else was this sort of natural, abundant palette that I mentioned before. And this project tackled almost every single UN SDG. And I think that by the time it was finished, the whole life carbon footprint of the project is estimated to be around about 240 kilos of carbon per square meter. And that's across all disciplines. So finishes, MEP, the lot, not just the structure. And that's a third of sort of business as usual for a university. I finished that secondment. I returned back to the UK to go back into that world of business as usual, and felt like there was this real disconnect between what I just spent the last year experiencing and how we went about designing stuff in the UK. During my time out there, I'd had my eyes opened to these impacts of our work that I guess I'd never really considered before, and I now added the word planet to my what used to be 3 Ps and have now become 4 Ps in terms of my sort of work goals. If I was going to do meaningful work, I wanted that to be sustainable. And it was pretty good timing to be worrying about this kind of thing, because this was now 2019. And this was when, at least in sort of my world, a bit of a revolution was starting to happen. 2019 was the year of school strikes. It was the year of Greta Thunberg, as we now consider it, depending on which calendar you use. And to me, this was the world waking up to climate change as being a real thing that we had to tackle. The phrase climate emergency entered the lexicon. It was, signed off by governments around the world that they acknowledged that this is a climate emergency that we are in. And this had become a mainstream conversation. This was no longer tree huggers and hippies. This affects all of us. And obviously what we've seen since then is that's only grown in scale as the climate around us has literally broken down further and further. And depending on where you're joining me from today, you can potentially see a horrific heat wave out your window or torrential downpours of rain or something in between. 2019 was also the year that in the UK, the built environment was starting to sort of declare this emergency and say that they wanted to do things about it. There are amazing people across the industry who've been working on this for decades, but they were finally being listened to by the sort of mainstream. The profession was finally waking up. Our profession of structural engineering was waking up to this acknowledgement that every engineer was probably responsible for thousands of tons of carbon per year in terms of their design. They're aware that a major building project could be 500,000 tons of carbon. These are bonkers numbers. And therefore, they're becoming aware that, reusable cups weren't really going to cut it with tackling climate breakdown. And since I'd got back to the UK, I'd obviously talked enough about the UN SDGs that it had been noticed. I've been known to have an opinion on most things in my time, and clearly this opinion has sort of got around as well. And it was actually Shalini who introduced me tonight, who was kind enough to ask me in early 29 whether or not I'd share my thoughts on the SDGs with the then board and council of the IStruct. I felt a bit sort of overwhelmed by this. I didn't really feel like I was an expert on this topic at this point in time. And there were many, many more expert people around than me who knew a lot more about the SDGs. But actually, I thought, well, you know what? There's enough experts around me in Arup who know about this stuff. And maybe it'd be a good thing for the board and council to hear from just a normal structural engineer who cares about this stuff. Maybe what we need is more bog standard engineers standing up and saying we need to do something different, to sort of join those expert voices that have been in the room for so long. So I started writing this presentation, and I spent hours sort of doggedly chasing people around Arup's headquarters saying, you know, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about job security? What about biodiversity breakdown? How does this all link to this stuff? And I wrote and rewrote and practiced this presentation because as I got closer and closer to the date of giving this, which, oh my God, you know what? I hadn't realized this was literally 5 years ago today, 19th of July. That's weird, isn't it? Sorry, 4 years ago today. As I got closer and closer, I realized how important this might be, and what a big opportunity there was for this. And when I showed up and gave this presentation, I remember it being polished to the point that actually it made me really quite angry and sad when I was giving this presentation. And there felt like there was, around this time, there was this sort of tipping point happening at the institution. There had been people before me pushing at this door for long enough now that at this board meeting, when I got to speak about these topics and got to highlight these thousands of tons that our members were responsible for, yet not being held responsible for, that door broke off its hinges and we went off in a direction that we haven't gone back from since. And off the back of this and the various other things happening around the time, the board of the IStruct passed a mandate that from now on sustainability would be treated the same as structural safety had always been treated. And as an institution, we got to work with working out what we were going to do about this thing. At which point I buggered off, rather bad timing for this, and took a 10-month sabbatical to go and travel around Asia. And I've got to say, I got on a plane quite a lot during that time, and I still feel guilty about it today. I'd had this sabbatical agreed with Arup for some time, and actually it was the first day of my unpaid leave that I spent in this council and board meeting doing this presentation. But I was due back the following summer. I remember my boss at the time saying, don't worry, if we've sold it by the time you get back, that's pretty good. I'm pretty sure there'll be things for you to do. And so this is how I wound up in the Philippines at a point in time when the world sort of threw on the brakes, and why I was out there and then flying home at short notice in early 2020. And I went from elephant pants and 40-degree heat to wearing 2 jumpers at a time and drinking cups of tea. So I was back in the UK in March 2020. And I found myself stuck now in the spare room of my in-laws' house. Boris Johnson, our esteemed Prime Minister at the time, then locked down the country and told us we could only go out once a day for exercise, preferably by ourselves. And I was back without a job, but without any significant outgoings, but nothing really to do with my time. So this point in time, I knew that the institution had been working on climate change and had been sort of progressing things since I'd left. And a chap called Mike Cook had been tasked with kind of trying to spearhead this change within the institution. So Mike Cook is the ex-chairman of Bureau Happold, and he was one of the founders of Structural Engineers Declare, which he set up and famously sat on a train with one of the founders of Architects Declare and said, oh, that's interesting. And he had been tasked with setting up the Climate Emergency Task Group of the institution. And he previously dropped me a message on LinkedIn saying something like, I'm going to be in Arup's cafe on Tuesday. Do you want to get a coffee? And I had to sort of awkwardly reply and say, I'm in a camper van in New Zealand. Not now, but can I get in touch when I get back? So now that I was back, I got in touch and we started planning. We thought this would be quite a good way to spend some of that free time that I found myself with. I remember Mike saying to me, you know, he had quite a clear sort of strategic look at all of this. And he sort of said to me, what do you want to see change first? And to me, the most important thing that we could start doing was just normalizing this topic for the membership, because this had been the realms of the sustainability specialists for far too long now. And we had to put it right in the middle of what people consider to be their day job. And so I started working with Robin Jones, the editor of the Structural Engineer magazine, and we agreed that from the middle of 2020, we would start to include climate emergency content in every magazine going forwards. And in June 2020, we sort of kick-started this mini revolution with the image you see in the middle of the screen, which I think was probably the first time we'd ever had a cover of the magazine that didn't have visible structures or buildings on it, unless you zoom in really, really, really far. And every month from June 2020 onwards, we have kept by that, and we have included climate emergency content, guidance, information, call it what you will, side of it. And we're now at the point in time where our sort of sustainability guidance looks like this. This is our resource map that's online. You can get it from the QR code or just search on Google. This shows you where we've come in the intervening years. When we started, the sort of equivalence of this looked a lot smaller. But some of this stuff is from sort of pre-2019. But it was a lot smaller. And my job wasn't to write any of this stuff. You got to remember, I still didn't really know a huge amount about sustainability. It's just something that I was quite passionate about. I'd read a lot around the topic during my sabbatical whilst I'd been away. But my job really was to try and work out who knew what and who could I persuade to write stuff for us to try and unlock this sort of abundance of knowledge that was kicking around the industry. Because it turns out there was loads of people out there who were really enthusiastic about this topic and really wanted to share what they knew with the wider industry. They just hadn't always been given the platform. So my job was to give them that platform. We're now at the point, like I say, it looks like this. I think we're up to 210 or so items of sort of sustainability guidance, and probably about a quarter or so that is free to anyone who wants it. So even if you're joining not as a member or you're unsure, that's okay too. You can access the sort of big picture principles stuff for free, because we were clear that we wanted those principles bits, those thought leadership bits, to be free for everyone in the industry. There's no point us just keeping everything to ourselves. A couple of really sort of key moments on this guidance generating journey was when we published How to Calculate Embodied Carbon and then the Structural Carbon Tool. And I won't say much about these, but if you haven't seen them before, please get hold of them. Again, you can just Google both of those titles. They'll come up pretty quickly on Google. This is the guidebook to calculating carbon for structural engineers on the left, and an Excel-based tool on the right that enables you to do that very quickly. And the two things come as a pair, so please do get both. But these as a pairing have enabled us to bring sort of consistency and simplicity to carbon calculations, and was a real turning point for us. And really grateful to John Orr and Orlando Gibbons for putting so much time into writing How to Calculate Embodied Carbon, and equally grateful to Penny Gowler and Elliot Wood for the amount of time they gave to create the tool that went alongside it, because these two things I think have really changed the game for structural engineers and have enabled us to get kind of ahead of our peers in some ways in terms of understanding this topic. Just as a reminder, I was still doing this pro bono through lockdown at this point in time. And actually my sabbatical was now coming to an end, and I was due to go back to Arup to restart work. It was clear to me, to Mike Cook, to Arup and the ISRT that we probably didn't want us to just drop what we'd started. It felt like we were onto a pretty good thing. And so we had an agreement between us that actually, why don't I go back to Arup part-time and start working for the institution part-time? And as any of you who have ever worked on two projects at once know, what that means is you get to dedicate about 3.5 days a week to one project and 3.5 days a week to the other project. So we started working flat out on both. And so, of course, by the time I think we got to January 2021, I made the decision that, Arup had always been my dream job, and it was amazing what I was doing there. But actually, we were on to quite a good thing here at the institution. We need change. And I was in quite a good position to be able to help drive that. So I left my job at Arup and became a full-time employee of the institution, reporting at that point in time directly to the chief exec with the sort of mandate to work across the staff to create internal change. And this enabled us to start normalizing sustainability within everything we do as an institution. So this document on the screen was us trying to help all of those people who give their time to write for us, provide training courses for us, do webinars for us, trying to help them understand what it is they needed to know and question in their work before they can start to present to members, so that we embedded this idea throughout all of our work. It's included updating standards that we hold people to from this year. To become a chartered structural engineer with us, you need to be carbon literate. So I think the version of the interview that happens at the end of this year, it's November, December time, I guess, is running to the new IPD regulations, which it has embodied carbon spread throughout it, both calculating it and reducing it and communicating it and so on. And that's all been given a real shake around. And as of next year, the exam is also updated in the same way, and there's more guidance going live on the internet around about this point in time, maybe in a couple of weeks' time. We've raised the bar for how we determine excellence as well. You know, if the exam and the interview are baseline requirements, then the structural awards is how we deem great engineering to look. And we no longer have awards in categories based around tall buildings and long span structures. We now judge projects on their own merits. We do so without categories. We've always been interested in their design and the construction process and things like that. But now we were explicitly starting to ask as well about the project's impact on people, impact on planet, impact on this profession. Because we're only going to accelerate change if we kind of work together and help the profession to grow. And all of that alongside the process of design and construction, of course. We also now mandate that all entries include a carbon footprint. And we use the structural carbon tool to do that. And we consider that indicatively during judging. That gives us a bit of a steer as to whether or not something's sort of touched lightly on the earth or not. We continue to support members with guidance. You know, I showed you the resource map before, but we've also got formal training courses out there. There's the e-learning Embodied Carbon Basics course for that's free for members, free for those in the affiliate scheme, and is a relatively small charge for non-members as well. And this teaches the basics of calculating carbon from scratch. It's a sort of 4-hour course. Teaches you how to calculate it, what to do with the results, how to deal with refurbishment projects, and so on. And then we've developed more in-depth training courses like Net Zero Structural Design, which is a sort of 10-hour CPD course delivered over 5 weeks, split between myself and a conceptual design teacher. And we've had 120-ish people go through this now, and the feedback's been really good. So we're really trying to sort of embed all of this stuff throughout all of our offering. And our most recent bit of, sort of big move that we've made happened last week when we launched our Circular Economy Design Guide. This is a 300-page guide that teaches you everything you need to know about the circular economy, how to apply it to the reuse of buildings, how to apply it to the reuse of elements and components and materials. How do you use a reclaimed steel beam? How might you go about reclaiming a concrete slab? And ultimately doing all of that and designing for the future at the same time to lock a building into a fully circular economy. And of course, we've got more guidance in the pipeline. There's a book being written about what regenerative design means for engineers, and specifically for structural engineers. And we continue to look for new opportunities and new ways to sort of grow our offering to members in the wider industry. And this is, that's a sort of snapshot of what we've done within the institution. But of course, this has happened at a time where the construction industry continues to evolve. And I guess the next few slides are probably mostly for those joining from outside the UK who aren't seeing all of this in our work. But when I gave my talk to Board and Council in 2019, I mocked up this newspaper on the left, which is not a real front cover, just to be very clear, and put it out there as a challenge to the institution that we should be calling on governments to introduce carbon limits in construction. Of course, now that I worked for the iStruct, I was kind of told that I better get on with it. And so we started working out what this meant. And just for a bit more context, again, for those outside the UK, there is already talk about how you would go regulating the amount of carbon emitted during the production of materials that's used on public projects. And the US has these buy clean policies, which again, they regulate that kind of thing. But what we're seeing in the UK is that the materials industries are telling us that by 2030, they might be making their materials 20% lower carbon than today, maybe not even that, because the technology is just not ready yet. Whereas the IPCC is saying we need to halve emissions by 2030. And so the only way to close that gap, short of accelerating R&D, of course, the other way to close that gap is to design more efficiently with materials, reuse more stuff, switch over to circular economy concepts, and so on. And so this is where the idea of what we called Part Z was born, the idea that a simple amendment to the building regulations would start to regulate the total embodied carbon emitted during the construction of a project, and that this could all be backed up with some pretty lightweight documentation. We did this against a backdrop of the very same sort of regulation happening across Europe. The whole continent is moving towards this. And again, this is not by clean style legislation. This is full on whole life carbon assessment legislation. And you see from this graph, or this chart rather, there are countries, and the Netherlands started this quite a long time ago, countries who have legislated the reporting of whole life carbon and have introduced initial limits on embodied carbon, some of which have already started to ratchet down. So the Netherlands famously ratcheted their carbon limits down by 20% 3 years after introducing them because everyone was managing to meet them already. So we wrote Part Z and we put it on the internet, and we started speaking to the industry to see what they thought of it. And this gives you a feeling for the sorts of players out there who said actually they were in support of all of this. Some of these firms have an international portfolio work and $1 billion turnover. Some of them have 2 employees who work out of a co-working space, but they're all saying the same thing. We're trying to do this anyway. Regulation would unlock us to do this job better. It would bring consistency, a level playing field, and so on and so forth. And this was a really key thing because once we had this buy-in of industry, we were able to start speaking to folk in governments and say, look, industry really wants this and really needs this. And the ISTRXE has been championing this now for, I guess, about 2 years or so. And we've had some progress. You know, this topic has now been debated in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which is our upper and lower houses of Parliament. So 2 debates around this topic. I never thought I'd see the day when a politician was debating the, A4 transportation embodied carbon emissions from a material and whether, therefore, steel from the north of England or the south of England was better. But there we are. That's where we've got things to. And whilst the government's not yet backing regulation like this, we are now at the point where the government department in charge of the building regs have commissioned £250,000 worth of research into the impact of doing so. And to me, that's a really clear notice of the direction of travel. And my hope is that within a year or so, we'll have a timeline for the introduction of such regulation. Of course, we're not going to wait. This is an industry that's enthused by this topic now. And so whilst we wait for government to introduce regulation in this area, a whole bunch of institutions have come together and said, well, why don't we just go and write the standard for what net zero would look like at the same time? This is a photo of what was meant to be a small briefing session at a conference back in March. And by the time we actually started talking, there was sort of 3 people deep standing room at the back. Seems the industry are actually quite keen on having a standard for what a net zero building means. And both Part Z and the standard are, these are our attempts and the industry's attempts to change the rule book, change the concept. And what's interesting actually, though, is that with both of them, neither of them have happened yet. And yet they are both changing the industry already because clients are getting, whether it's excited or nervous, I don't know, but they are getting the feeling that they need to act ahead of time on this. And so we're seeing engineers be empowered to create lower carbon solutions already. And this is neat because this is all working as part of a sort of carbon ecosystem in the UK that enables us to do all of this. So we have the RICS professional statements on whole life carbon assessment for the built environment, and that feeds into net zero carbon building standard that would set 1.5 degree aligned limits on things like embodied operational energy and so on. It would feed into Part Z if we get such regulation to go through, and it feeds into the BECD, that's the sort of reporting database that would then feed back in to the PS via the sort of data that it gathers. And likewise, the BECD is being championed as the way that both the standard and Part Z should get people to log their data and again feed back out to set ourselves things like carbon factors and so on. That was a big sort of run through. You can see we've done quite a lot as an institution. There's quite a lot going on in the industry in the UK right now, and it's been quite exciting to be a part of that. But I just want to sort of finish with a bunch of slides that talk about the success behind all of this, whether we think that we've seen change happen on a sort of, you know, the scale that we need, and why things have and haven't happened as we might want them to. We ran a survey of our membership at the end of last year to basically try and get people to reflect on their skill set today versus their skill set of 2018 before we started moving on this. And it's shown good progress. I think it's also shown us that there's still some clear gaps in certain parts of our knowledge, and we are now digging deeper into the survey results to understand how this varies with the demographics of the people who answered. But this is positive feedback for us, so this was really, really great to see this sort of formalized. So hopefully that sort of, you know, that's enough to say I think we have been successful. And the more interesting thing now, I think, is the question of why. And there's a few things that have led into this. I think the first thing on this, and potentially the most important thing, is that from day one, so from the point in time when the board and the council said, you know, we've got to do something, we have an important role to play in all of this, the chief executive, the board of trustees, the council, and then all of the staff that followed all backed this mantra of safety and sustainability being put on a par with one another. That meant that we could make important decisions. That meant that, you know, the idea of hiring a full-time paid member of staff to be head of climate action and champion this stuff wasn't so big of a question anymore. It seemed pretty obvious that if we were going to truly tackle these things on a par, we needed someone on staff to work with it. And that's therefore enabled us to do more with our volunteers, with our membership, because it's meant that I can take the time to work with them and sort of craft what they need to get out of there. So putting that importance on thing is important, because then people have gotten behind the idea. And this was also true of when, like I mentioned before, when I started full time, I reported into Martin, who was the chief exec at the time. We now actually have a sort of technical department set up within this institution, so I now sort of sit within that. But at this point in time, I'd been asked to sort of work across the way we work with the institution. And the Climate Emergency Task Group has similarly been asked to work across the technical committees and panels that we have as an institution. So again, in terms of that sort of agency, in terms of creating change, we've had impact because we've been able to work across everything else. We haven't sat in a sort of corner. The CETG, we're liaising with me. I was liaising, you know, I used to meet monthly with the chief exec. We would talk about, you know, the changes that I was keen to try and push through and try and work out how we're going to make that work with this idea of the institution being a rock for its members. And the CETG would also sort of liaise with the other committees, working with engineering leadership group and so on. So this gave us this sort of broad, fast ability to create change. We try to be consistent in what we were doing. So to make sure that we made the most of the fact that we'd started to get people's attention on this topic, we didn't let it drop. We've pushed for sustainability in the structural engineer since June 2020, and it hasn't relented. It really hasn't. And, you know, hats off to Robin for continually keeping the pages full of this stuff. To start with, we had a dedicated section to climate emergency. It was coloured in green, which is quite nice because it happens that we have an iStructE green to go with it. But actually from 2022 onwards, we got rid of that. We phased it out because we were starting to get to the point where this thinking was becoming embedded in the articles that people submitted anyway. So people were writing in about with a project write-up, and they were including commentary on the embodied carbon footprint. And, you know, it was quite nice to see the sort of honesty come through from the authors, because these projects have been written up, of course. They've been designed in 2016, 2012, maybe even earlier in some cases, was when original concepts had been kicked off. And so these were not always low carbon projects, but the engineers were feeling empowered now to speak about it anyway and talk about maybe what they would have done differently if they had their time again. And so now the way we do this with TSE is that this is all back in the hands of the editor, and I sort of dip in from time to time and speak with him about what's coming up and ask him what needs reviewing. And I think this will only continue into the future. This isn't going to go away. Another thing on consistency, of course, is that we've tried to work across all the institutions' work. So I think the magazine is maybe the sort of main shop window to our members. But of course, we have our awards, we have our young members panels, we have all of our regional groups, we have a whole suite of conferences and webinars and things like that. And it's become really consistent in amongst all of this stuff that sustainability is the job of the structural engineer now. This can't be avoided. And it's embodied carbon, it's resource use, it's biodiversity impacts. And whilst we're all at different places on that journey, we have to embed that thinking because we can't leave it up to somebody else. And that's come through in everything that we've done in the last few years. We've tried to keep the messaging simple within that. We've worked on keeping these messages clear and, understandable and aimed at regular engineers. It's not been messages around specifics of embodied carbon. It's been messages around how easy it is to do it and how it's, just do a back of envelope calculation at least and work out where the biggest bit of carbon is. And of course, I mentioned before the sort of difference in buy clean and the sort of Part Z approach. We've been clear from day one. This is about the whole picture. This is not about waiting for materials to decarbonize. This is not about a simple silver bullet where you switch everything over to one particular type of material or something like that. You have to do the numbers. They're easy, and we've made them easier for you, but you do just have to do it and then use that to inform your decision making. And that's been the message throughout this time. We've supported it with sort of diagrams and thinking and hierarchies like this. This has then gone on to inform the push for reuse and circular economy and all of that kind of thing. But this again supports the sort of this decade message, that graph with the 2030 piece and the need to halve emissions by then. This is about using less stuff, and that's the responsibility of the designer. And very, very finally, this is the last sort of point to make on the why. In terms of sort of, teams that I've ever been a part of, this is by far and away the biggest team I've ever been a part of, because somehow whilst we don't have many climate action staff at the institution, we've got about, I think there's at least 200 volunteers so far who have put time into generating these various things that I've shown you. And my job throughout my time at the institution has been about mobilizing this sort of abundance of knowledge and enthusiasm. Remember, when I started this in 2020, I knew very little about this subject. This is about giving people a platform and helping them to share what they knew quickly. And as such, the right people have spoken on the right topic. We've got this community now that continues to help drive change because we know who these people are. We can get in touch with them again. This has enabled us to work sort of reactively rather than trying to plan everything out with a 2-year time frame and a giant committee. We've instead just sort of gone to the right people, or when someone's come to us with an opportunity, we've said, yes, let's do that. When Elliot Wood came to us and said, we'd like to turn our in-house carbon tool into something with you, we saw that there was real potential to do that quickly, and we jumped on it and we worked out how to make it work. We realized that now was the right time to start having the regulation topic. We found a handful of the right people, and we started writing Part Z. So this idea of sort of unlocking abundance of knowledge and enthusiasm by picking the right bits at the right time has been really key with that. So to sort of summarize, I think it's a combination of these things that have enabled the sort of changes to be made that we've seen. We've got our 200 piece of guidance. We've updated our chartered structural engineer requirements, or our PE requirements, those of you listening in the US, our awards, our cross-industry initiatives. All of this stuff, I think, has been led by these sort of five main things. And I hope you'd agree on sort of looking at all that. It's all pretty exciting what's happened. I feel grateful to have been given this job, to have been able to sort of travel these million miles that I feel like I've traveled in the last 5 years. And I feel really fortunate, actually, to be surrounded by staff and volunteer members who have been so willing to prioritize this subject and find time to make this change happen. This industry has this phenomenal impact on the world, good and bad. We create these amazing places for people and this amazing infrastructure that connects people. But we're now at a phase of waking up to the sort of cost to nature and to the climate, and maybe to other parts of society that we don't see that we're having. Something like 98% of all human-made stuff by weight is the built environment. And I think at least half of that's probably the buildings and the structures. And of course, that comes with a huge waste flow out to the other end. So we use all this stuff, and we therefore have to do better with it. And I think we are starting to move things in the right direction. And I do believe that eventually this industry can become net positive. And I just feel lucky that we've been able to sort of play a role in making that start here and now at the beginning. I'm going to finish with a short video. Apologies, some of you might have seen this before. If you have and you don't want to watch it again, then you're about to have a 4-minute break if you want to grab a glass of water. But for those of you who haven't, please take a look at this. If you like it and you want to share it with others, you can go on YouTube afterwards. But I think this sums up the work we've done in the last 4 minutes. We created this for COP26 and we've played it again and again ever since. We are experiencing record-breaking storms, droughts, fires, ecosystem collapse, climate migration, which has been brought about by human-induced global warming through years of excessive greenhouse gas emissions, including that from buildings and construction. As these storms and droughts and fires become stronger and more frequent, they will have a larger and larger impact on our lives. What are you going to do about it?
We will exceed 1.5 degrees global warming around about my 40th birthday, bringing previously unprecedented heat waves to Europe almost every other year. By the time I'm my grandma's age, the world will be 2 degrees warmer, locking in as much as 4 metres of future sea level rise and destroying every beach you've ever visited. Our families and friends are looking at a future of yearly weather cycles, currently thought of as once-in-a-lifetime events. And the financial cost will be measured in trillions of dollars per year. We must prevent this future from happening.
Almost 40% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are due to buildings and construction. I'll try to put that number into perspective. Most of our personal decisions could be quantified in terms of kilograms of carbon emissions. So if you skip a steak, you save 30 kilograms of carbon. If you avoid flying from London to New York, you save 800 kilograms of carbon. But in comparison, when the engineers, architects and clients worked together to save this 1950s building from demolition and enabled its reuse as a high-spec office space, we saved 13,000 tons of carbon. That's the same as 16,000 flights from London to New York. Imagine the impact that could be made if we started making reuse decisions like this on every project. We must take our professional responsibility seriously if we want to make the biggest impact we can on global emissions.
The climate crisis presents not only a threat, but also an opportunity. An opportunity for me, for you, for all of us, to make a significant difference to the future of life on this planet. We can't afford to indulge ego and gratification. It's time to move away from taking pride in being the tallest, the longest, or the most heroic. We can do so much better than this. This is an opportunity to create buildings and infrastructure which, by being the smartest, the leanest, the most regenerative, will make a positive impact on the world. Not just for today's generation, but for every generation after. The Institution of Structural Engineers and our partners across the industry are providing the tools and guidance necessary to do all of this. Our profession has never been better equipped to reduce carbon emissions, and it's never been more important than now.
At the institution, we've been working tirelessly to put sustainability on a par with our enduring commitment to life safety. But for lasting change to happen, this needs all of us. The whole industry needs to raise our game. To drive the change we need to see, each of us must commit to something bold, and we must do it now. It's not the detail that's important, it's the ambition, the level of transparency, and the ability to track progress and strive for improvement. It's time to commit to doing things better.
Global warming will affect us and every single generation that follows us. So when you are asked by your children and your grandchildren about the role you had to play during the climate emergency, what will you tell them?
I'll start with a lovely question, actually a rather difficult question that I'm sure many of us engineers ask ourselves as well. It comes from Louise Fabreau. She gave some comments first. She said, "Hello, thanks for this very interesting presentation. It looks very encouraging for the future. I'm a student and I'm just finishing an internship with a conservation engineering company working with care engineer on actively reusing and repairing structures. I've noticed some contradictions and I'm questioning. I know about the ICE technical notes encouraging, if I may say so, no design. How can we encourage companies to not design unnecessary repairs on existing structures when most companies charge design fees? They actually earn out of proposing designs." Thank you.
It's that's a good opening question. I like it. So I think firstly we should be careful not to confuse no design with no construction. And actually, I think that what we're going to see in the coming years, and we've already started to see it, is more and more engineers to work out a way in which they can help a client to reuse what that client already owns without having to do so much to it. So my favorite example of this is still the project that Bureau Happold did for the Elizabeth line, which is a new metro line through central London. And the Elizabeth line runs on, some of the parts that it runs on is existing train tracks. These have overhead gantries, and the clients of those gantries, Network Rail, thought they were going to have to replace about 500 of them or something. And the engineers basically worked with Network Rail to prove that they could keep over, I think in the end they only replaced a handful, like 5 maybe, and they strengthened another 20 or so. To do that involved some really hard engineering and a lot of work and a lot of time, and they probably got paid, they didn't get paid nothing because they only replaced 5 gantries, right? They all got paid professional design rates for that. At the end of it, the client was very happy because actually what the client didn't really want new gantries anyway. They just wanted to be able to run the Elizabeth line on their rails, and they wanted that with the least amount of disruption. That's what the engineer gave to them. And I've heard similar stories of engineers working with clients to help them understand that actually they maybe don't need to repurpose an entire office space. Maybe they've got ways they can do it with what they've already got. But I think that there will always be a role for creative design to enable all of that, and engineers will be needed to do that. It just may not involve us pouring so much concrete at the end of it.
That's a great example, Will. Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Louise. Now, another question is, do we have any examples of the use of the structural carbon tool that's available online for members and non-members?
Yeah, so you download the tool from the website. When you open it, it will be blank. If you also download How to Calculate Embodied Carbon and you go to the appendices, either Appendix 1 or 2, I forget which one, there's an example that we did in there that's got a sort of hand calculation of the carbon footprint of a small pavilion. And it's then got the sort of replicated screens from the structural carbon tool. So you could copy paste the numbers in from that if you wanted to. We don't have an example you can just download. That's probably the quickest way to go about doing it.
Okay, great. And you had mentioned that sustainability is going to be considered as part of one of the central criteria for the routes to membership and to becoming a chartered structural engineer. Can you explain a little bit more on what aspects of sustainability the institution is keen on? Yeah,
so best bet is to look at the web page that's got the new IPD regulations on it. And if you search on our website, you'll be able to find those fairly easily. I believe there's more information coming later this year in the structural engineer as well, sort of outlining the changes. In essence, embodied carbon has been sort of embedded into everything. So that's a really strong part of it. But only really embedded to the point of the sort of basic level of knowledge that you can learn from our embodied carbon basics course. So we recognize that not every engineer out there will have had the opportunity or the right clients or necessarily even the right boss to have been able to sort of, fully embrace low carbon design. And they might be restricted to just knowing the basics, but it's only the basics that we're requiring. That's the sort of main gist of it. There's some other bits in there about, encouraging people to consider reuse and stuff like that. But your best bet is to go on the information that's on the membership pages for that.
Actually, it's good that you mentioned reuse because one of the other questions is, are there examples or publication, probably in the structural engineer or elsewhere, that gives actual project examples of deconstruction and reuse?
Yeah, there are. So two guides worth looking. So there's a bunch of articles in the structural engineer, and the quickest way to find the right ones is to go to that sustainability resource map that I mentioned, which if you just search that term in iStruct or something, you'll find it pretty quickly. And one of the arms of that spider diagram is about reuse. You can click all of the links in it, so that'll take you through some project examples there. And there's one of the other arms is case studies or something like that. So some of those are also reuse projects. The guide Design for Zero has a bunch of reuse case studies inside of it, because Design for Zero is structured more or less around the same sort of triangle hierarchy I showed you. So it has a section on build less, and within that there's reuse. So within the case studies section of that, there's good projects to check out. And of course, the circular economy guide that we've just published, that's full of case studies, like I couldn't even tell you how many. And a quarter of that guide's all about reusing existing buildings. So there's case studies in there on reuse of buildings, and then the next quarter is about reusing elements, and there's case studies on people doing that. For those of you who are sort of not based in central London, you may not have seen what's going on at the moment, but there's a huge number of developers trying to actually get reclaimed steel beams to work on their projects. And some of this stuff has been built in sort of smallish quantities, 20 tons here, 25 tons there kind of thing. But there are some case studies in there of people trying to do even bigger and better things.
Okay, we have a question from Max, and it says, hello, thanks for the webinar. I'm a student about to start my placement year, and I was wondering if there were any iStructE courses or accreditations that I can do now to improve my knowledge in the field of sustainability.
Yep.
That's the first question.
So best thing, quickest thing for you to do would be to go on the Embodied Carbon Basics course. Search for that on the website. If you're a student member of the institution, it's free. If you're not, then become a student member, because to become a student member is also free. You then get free access to Embodied Carbon Basics. That would be the quickest way to do some sort of quick upskilling. That's probably the best starting point. Beyond that, the best thing I could advise would be to read some of the guidance, have a go with the structural carbon tool. When you're on your placement year, you could even speak to your mentor or your boss for that and say, can you help me fill in this tool? Where would I go to get material quantities from? And you can sort of try putting it into practice through that.
Okay, and the second part of his question is, the bamboo course mentioned in the resources interests me greatly, but seems to be targeted only to graduates and upwards. Could they still be useful for students?
The bamboo course, I don't know much about the bamboo course, if I'm honest. So I'd say, oops, sorry, my camera turned off for a second there. I'd suggest getting in touch with the events team. You could email them, just events@iStructE.com, and ask them whether they think it's suitable, and they can find out from the presenters for you.
Okay, and Akbar had a comment, not a question, but feel free to make a remark on it. The planning system is a key driver in this. The system should encourage the use of existing buildings and make it difficult for the planning authority to refuse planning permission. Is there anything that you'd like to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably nuance it slightly more than that. There are times when, you might need some new construction. And I think that actually, a lot of us are probably guilty of thinking with the sort of rich world mindset where, I live in a city just outside of London, and we have most of the buildings that we're going to need for the next few decades. And so, of course, our planning system should really heavily prioritize reusing what we've got and extending those buildings upwards, and trying to work with them to make them more relevant to today's uses. But of course, if you're working in Nairobi or Luanda or Dakar or somewhere like that, you're working with people who need a huge amount of infrastructure and buildings creating for them in the forthcoming years. Not to say that reuse would not also be a good skill to have in those parts of the world, because of course it is, and there might be strengthening works and things like that need to be doing as part of it. But I think that those in that sort of majority world, if you like, because that's where 80% of humanity lives, there's a lot more construction still to do. So actually, it's I'd say that the view on, or the comments on planning would be specific to different regions and different parts of the world.
Okay, then Sarah makes a comment and asks two questions. She says, thank you for the presentation. She's left feeling hopeful about the changes that we will see. She liked that structural engineers have always been in part responsible for decisions, but not yet held accountable. Building construction is multidimensional with many stakeholders. Who else do you think needs to own the carbon responsibility?
Well, I guess it's a bit of a oversimplification when I said at some point that the structural engineer is responsible for 2,000 tons a year or whatever it was I said. Obviously, the construction of a building takes a lot of people. For even a small job, you might be talking 100 people, and for a mega project, you're talking thousands. So there is clearly a shared responsibility throughout that. What I would say, though, is generally speaking, the higher up the sort of decision-making tree you are, the more responsibility lies with you. So it's funny, actually, because the Net Zero Structural Design course we give, I've now given it for structural engineers, and we've also done private sessions for an architecture firm and for a local authority. And at all three of those have told me that the person above them in the food chain or the decision-maker responsibility is the one stopping them from doing the really sustainable solution. And I imagine if I worked out who was above the local authority and spoke to them, they'd tell me there was somebody above them as well. So the reason I'm saying this is that I think that there is clearly shared responsibility, and clearly the more senior you are in making decisions, the more impact you can have. But that doesn't mean that just because there's someone above you, you have no responsibility. And actually, I think what we've seen that's been really great in the last few years have been this sort of grassroots movement, particularly of a lot of like young engineers and designers saying to their bosses, no, we need to do better. We need to change the sorts of projects we bid on. Then I don't have a responsibility for what projects we do and don't do, but I'm going to make it very clear to you as my boss what sorts of jobs I don't want to work on anymore, because I believe they're not being useful for the world. So take this opportunity to speak upwards. When I say speak up, I mean upwards, not just up. Because lots of your peers are doing it as well.
Okay, and the other part of her question is, and just as you've put sustainability on parallel with safety, how can we encourage stakeholders to put carbon at an equal importance to cost?
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because even at this point in time, cost is still the one thing that seems, for 99% of projects, cost ends up being the litmus test. There's a couple of things. So your question is, how do you get a client to put it on a par with cost? And my advice would be that the earlier you can sit down with that client and talk to them about their sustainability ambitions, the better. So I used to have a colleague at Arup called Mel, and she had this wonderful tactic that I probably shouldn't give away because people see it coming now, but let's hope none of our clients are listening. She had this wonderful tactic at the start of the project. She'd sit down with the architects and then with the client team, and she would have done her research as to what those firms' environmental sort of declarations were online. This architect has said that they're going to do such and such a thing, they're going to halve this and cut back on that and so on. And she'd workshop with them what that meant to them and what they thought that meant on that project. And she'd then remind them of this through the design process to say, I know this is maybe slightly more expensive than this, but without this, we can't do any of those things you said at the start. And obviously you can't, change your client's mind overnight on all of this stuff, but just having those sorts of conversations, I think, is how you get the change to start to happen. And maybe on the next project, the client will say, well, we need to approach this earlier in a different way. The other thing I'd say on cost and carbon is that not all low carbon solutions have to cost more than high carbon solutions. And actually, what I've been hearing from industry is that if you get involved early enough, and if you have the right brief on the project, you can deliver a low carbon building for the same cost as a high carbon equivalent, if not less. And so the key things around reducing structural carbon are things like the span lengths. If you halve the span, it's WL squared upon 8 for the engineers in the room. So if you halve the span, that's a quarter of the bending moment. And so your material savings are phenomenal if you can reduce your spans. And that's just one example. You get big savings if you can avoid transfer structures and cantilevers and heroics and basements and things like that. And these are moves that usually reduce material quantity and therefore carbon, and also reduce cost, because it doesn't in any way make it more expensive to construct. It's simpler to construct. It's probably more resilient because we understand what we're doing a bit better. We're not trying to do complicated things, and we're using less material, so you get this sort of win-win-win. But in order to end up in that position, you have to have the conversations early enough that the concept is a low carbon concept, if this becomes a conversation you only have quite late in the day when you're detailing and issuing specifications, then yes, it probably will cost more because you've designed business as usual, and then you're trying to sort of shoehorn in a slightly lower carbon spec to sort of try and boost your credentials. It just doesn't really work so well then.
Okay, fair. Then Mohammed asked a question. He asked, what are the key challenges faced when trying to change the norm towards sustainability?
Well, we just covered the cost one, and that's definitely a key challenge. I'd say that, I mean, this is obviously slightly hard for me to comment on because I don't work as a practicing engineer right now. I think that there's a challenge around, so maybe it's an education piece, not quite sure, but there's a challenge around helping people understand what low carbon actually means and what more sustainable actually means. Because there's a lot of sort of, some people will call it greenwash, but there's a lot of these opinions floating around that aren't necessarily entirely all that useful to people. So the idea that if you build everything out of timber, that's better and that's more sustainable is not true. Because if I'm building a very long span train bridge with a lot of load on it, potentially I'm going to have to use so much timber that it'll be so inefficient that actually it would have been lower carbon to have made that thing out of steel. Similarly, the idea that you can buy a low carbon concrete isn't really true, because most of them are based on replacing cement, clinker with other resources that are fully utilized around the world, and therefore if you use more of that stuff, somebody else uses less of it. So this idea that there's these some easy things we can do with materials, I think that for a lot of people that's quite a big challenge, because you have to somehow tell the client that they're wrong early on enough, and then give them solutions to help them deal with that before you get too far down the line. So yeah, that would be, after cost, I'd say that's probably one of the next biggest challenges.
Well, I think you may be clairvoyant, because the next question is, what are your thoughts? This comes from Rebecca. What are your thoughts on GGBS and other cement replacements?
Okay, so if you want to know my thoughts on GGBS, then if you go on my LinkedIn and you find a PDF that we published a couple of weeks ago on GGBS, then you'll see exactly what my thoughts are on it. There's a paper that I've sort of led the writing of that's a sort of cross-industry paper. So it's been fed into by the Concrete Centre, some designers, some academics, looking at the global supply of GGBS and therefore what that means if you use it on a project. We're going to publish the final version of it in September, but we published a draft a few weeks ago because we debated it with Concrete Zero's membership. And the feedback was mostly positive. And what that basically says, and what my opinion of GGBS is that almost all of the iron slag in the world is already turned into GGBS. So probably about 90% of it or so is already turned into GGBS. It does, from what I've seen, there's no indication that you can get that number any higher, really. Probably not even to 100%, because it's you can sell GGBS for more than the other things you can turn slag into. And therefore, if it could be higher, it probably already would be. So there's not much room to make any more of it. There's also not really any stockpiles and stuff lying about, as far as we know. So therefore, what exists or is generated by the world every year is already used. Therefore, if you ask for more of it on your project, somebody else probably gets less of it. And therefore, you have this carbon whack-a-mole effect. Your emissions go down, somebody else's go up, global emissions stay the same. And it's an issue because it means that whilst we're all chasing carbon targets for our projects, and I'm fully aware that Part Z is all about carbon targets and projects, whilst we're all chasing that, if the only way we meet them is to ask for more GGBS in our concrete and more scrap steel in our steel specification, because it's exactly the same problem with scrap, what will happen is we will think we've met our targets, but global emissions won't go down because somebody else's emissions will go up. It will just be somebody who's not calculating carbon. And so instead, this is why we have that hierarchy of use less stuff that comes first and foremost, and using material more efficiently and reuse and circular economy, all those sorts of things has to come first, because there's not a huge amount we can do with our material specs today.
Well, she did ask a second part of a question, and it's, will Part Z consider sustainability more holistically, considering biodiversity, habitat loss, rather than purely embodied carbon, which seems to be where most of the conversation is currently focused?
Yeah. So Part Z is entirely about carbon emissions. It's entirely about greenhouse gas emissions. It calls for two things. It calls for the reporting of whole life carbon emissions on every project over a certain size, and then calls to limit upfront embodied carbon emissions. So just the embodied carbon emitted up to the point where you hand the keys over to the client. Sustainability is this way bigger, knottier, thornier thing than that. Biodiversity seems to be the next thing that engineers are starting to sort of ask questions about right now. And there's a couple of really good bits of research going on looking into so-called embodied biodiversity, which is the impacts at source of where your materials come from, not the impacts on your site, that we've started to actually get quite good at least in the UK. But what happens where at the place where you get your sand out of a river, or your gravel out of a gravel pit, or your bauxite out of an iron mine? Sorry, that's aluminium. Iron ore out of an iron mine. But sorry, what are the impacts there? Beyond that, though, I mean, there's social sustainability issues. There are apparently mafias in India that are dealing sand in a very not in a nice way for the people who they make extract it. And there's all sorts of sort of labour rights issues around the world, and we don't deal with any of those things in the way that we should do yet. So Part Z is tackling a very tiny bit of the sustainability puzzle. It's tackling what I guess we've considered to be the lowest hanging fruit, and even with that, we're struggling to get buy-in from government. So at the moment, no, there's no plans to try and get it to tackle sustainability more holistically. But of course, we need to. That's not me saying that we shouldn't be thinking about these other things. It's just saying that Part Z itself is trying to focus on the smallest crack that we can make in the sustainability picture.
Okay, and I believe we have two other questions, unless any more comes in. There's one from Emma. She asks, how would you suggest that engineers drive sustainability in structural design, particularly in highly regulated industries, example, nuclear and energy industries, where safety and security have historically take precedence?
So I think, I mean, safety has to take precedence everywhere, but sustainability is a form of safety, right? It's a long-term safety. It's just, you can either design a building with not enough material and it falls down and kills people today, or you can design a building with too much material and it effectively kills some people who are in different parts of the world, and you kill them slowly over the next few years. It all comes back to the same thing. So you have to, regardless of which industry you work in, you have to take responsibility for the emissions of your work. I appreciate that, yeah, some industries are way more heavily regulated than others, and there are minimum quantities to everything in all parts of the world. I mean, even in the most unregulated of industries, there's a minimum amount of shear links you need to have to do with cracking. When you're doing it, even the most basic concrete specification, we ask for the minimum amount of cement that we need to put into that concrete. But what we're kind of less good at is specify maximums for everything. So, that minimum that's been set by code or by regulation, that's the minimum safe amount. Why do we go putting more than that in so much of the time? Concrete specs go out the door with a minimum cement requirement and a minimum water cement ratio and no maximums. And so people who want to make sure they pass cube tests and it goes away, they'll just add a bit more cement, because in countries like the UK, that's way cheaper than having to deal with it later on. So I think that we need a mindset shift, and it doesn't matter which part of the industry you're in. This is no longer about that's the minimum thing required for safety and anything above it's okay. That's still there, but there's this as well, and that's your sort of ceiling. And above that, we shouldn't be exceeding it. And Chris Wise, you saw him in that film at the end, he's got this sort of mantra of "and no more" that he's been saying for a very long time. We need to get into our codes of practice, because when it says you need to design this floor to be able to support 3 kPa of load, it should probably say 3 kPa and no more, because at the moment we end up designing them so they can then support 4 or 6 or 8, just depending on which day of the week it is sometimes. So yeah, I think moving towards that sort of bounded mentality would help in all situations, even those regulated ones.
Okay, and then Susanna, she asks, or she says, when trying to convince the higher ups, the chain, decision makers at engineering firms that sustainability design is worth investing in, what would you recommend? Thinking specifically of SE 2050 in the USA and how to get more firms to sign up.
So I think that, and this is a nice question to finish on, right? Because this question of how do we get more people to care? If you to make your question a bit more encompassing, I think that's kind of what it comes down to. And how do you make them care from a business sense? And I don't run a business, but I do get to speak to lots of them. And that's been quite a good fun bit of my job since I left Arup. I've learned about all these other firms that exist that aren't all called Arup. Would you believe it? And the thing that I've heard consistently is that those who are leading change in this field, part of the reason why they're doing it is because they know this is only going to go in one direction. Climate breakdown is only going to get worse. What we see on the news today at the moment about these heat waves and stuff that are happening is just going to become more and more regular. In the UK, there was a letter sent to the current Prime Minister this week from something like 200 big businesses, basically saying you need to speed up, you need to be more ambitious with net zero. We are all calling on you to do this, and that included Tesco's and IKEA and places like that. So the firms that are doing this are doing it because they see that this is only going to go in that direction, and they want to be winning the work from their clients before their competitors get there. So if you want a business reason to embrace sustainability and low carbon design, it's that if you don't do it, you're going to become pretty irrelevant pretty quickly because all your competitors are already doing it. And all that's going to happen is you're going to fall behind. You're going to get the worst graduates coming out of university rather than the best ones. You get the least motivated people. And you're going to find it very, very hard to do business in a sort of net zero world. So you kind of don't really have much choice. It's just up to you as to when you choose to act rather than if.